Hello and welcome back to Impact Factor. It has been 4 weeks without a guest, and I'm excited to bring you our next couple of interviews, starting with this one, who features another Haverford grad who is currently working in the meta-science space, so I'm excited for you to hear about that. And so, without further ado, Jordan Dworkin, PhD. Okay, so Jordan, I guess we certainly haven't seen each other since college, right? So that was how many years? 20,
Oh man.
2015, 2012 is when I graduated. So like almost 10 years.
Yeah,
Yeah. But you know my brother pretty well.
I do. Yeah, we
Yeah.
played frisbee together.
Yeah, that's good. Are you still playing?
No, I'm trying to get back into tennis, which I now realize frisbee kind of messes with because
Oh,
arms want to do a frisbee throw instead. So
interesting.
that's my struggle right now.
I would never have thought of that, but that's definitely true.
Yeah.
Hmm. Well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll talk about that later, but um so why don't you tell me? So I know you went to Haverford, obviously, but what was kind of your major and your path to your PhD program like?
Yeah, so at Haverford, I was a psychology major. I did my thesis actually at Bryn Mawr with Mark Schultz, who works on kind of social psychology, relationships. Recently wrote a book called The Good Life, which is like a really
Oh,
interesting exploration of a kind of longitudinal data set of happiness and relationship health that he's been working on for ages. So yeah, that was a great experience. That was my entrance into kind of like quantitative research. And through that work, I ended up minoring in statistics as well. So that was kind of how I learned about statistics as a field. And I guess as a spoiler, that was what I ended up doing grad in. Um, but yeah, I think I kind of was always interested in research, but not exactly sure if psychology and social psychology was like my full career path. So I kind of tried to expand into more like quantitative tools and methods through that 4 year experience.
cool. So when you were, I guess, wrapping up at Haverford, you did a thesis, of course, but were you planning to go into to continue that like right away, or was it sort of like a maybe I should take a time off, or you know?
Yeah, I did go straight, and I remember grappling with it a bit. I think like my my heart said that taking a break would be nice because another 5-ish years of schooling would be overwhelming. But I think somewhere along the line, I decided that like while I was still fresh with research and with statistical methods and kind of in that headspace, it would probably be more effective to go straight through to graduate school. I don't really know how I feel at this point. I know people who have really thrived in both approaches. Um, but I do think I could have potentially benefited from
Yeah.
doing something else for a little bit.
Yeah, I know the same. I feel the same way. I know people who did both ways and they all succeeded and it was great. I like to think that I also went straight through and I like to think that at least the perk is that I was only 28 when I finished instead
Yeah,
of 29 or 30. So that's that's what helps me get through that decision.
yeah, it's definitely a perk.
Um okay, so you went straight through. And you were looking for specifically statistics programs. Were they statistics with any sort of application slant?
Yeah, so I mostly applied to biostatistics programs. Um, the primary reason was because I think functionally for PhDs. Biostatistics programs tend to kind of orient themselves as just applied statistics.
Mm,
Um, they are usually focused on kind of methods for public health or for biomedical research. But I think in the way that they educate you, they kind of highlight the way you can apply the math to real world problems. And a lot of statistics departments are more oriented towards what a mathematics PhD would look like in terms
gotcha.
of like solving proofs on pen and paper. So with my
Yeah.
psych background, I was always kind of more on the applied side of things.
Okay. So the department itself or the degree itself was biostatistics.
Yeah,
And where did you go?
I ended up at Penn,
Ah, heard of it.
stayed
Just
in
down
Philly.
the road. Um, how big is that department? Or is it or what is it under, you know?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was about 8 students per year, so ended up somewhere in like the 50-ish
Okay.
range. It was under a kind of broader biomedical graduate studies umbrella that
Okay.
was probably a couple hundred, and that included all sorts of kind of bio and biochem and bioengineering type programs.
Cool.
Yeah.
Did you have to do any catch up on the bio side?
I should have done more than I did. Yeah, you do have to take some classes. We had a big textbook. It was like the human body in health and disease. So we kind of
Mm,
took like an intro, like anatomy and biology class as part of the PhD program. You weren't really expected to have that background, though I'm sure it's beneficial in terms of like understanding your eventual research program. Uh,
that's good though that the expectation wasn't there because that can be tough where the class is made up of people who already know all of this and people who don't, and then that's sort of like off-putting right away, right?
yeah, it does still kind of end up a bit like that,
Mm,
where there are some students who come in with like a really kind of strong mathematics background and they're like all ready for the theory. And there are some students who come in with like a psychology background or a pre-med background who
mm,
are like really excited for the applied question, but don't have like real analysis in their
right.
undergrad program. So you do end up with a pretty interesting cross section of people who come at the problems from a
That's
lot of
cool.
different perspectives.
Yeah, well, there you go. That's the perk of that is that you have people with different perspectives. So good
Yeah.
conversations, I'm sure. Um, when you started, excuse me, you were taking classes. Were you already sort of assigned to a lab at that point, or was it sort of a shopping around environment?
It was a shopping around environment, which is actually one of the main reasons I chose Penn
Mm,
over Minnesota, which was the other one I was considering. Um, so Penn has a kind of rotation program for your first 2 years. So you spend like a semester working in different labs. And I think it does that because it's part of a medical school and part of a biomedical program where
mm.
I think that's traditional. Though listeners can correct me if that's wrong. So we kind of adopted that from their kind of biomedical approach. And I really enjoyed that opportunity. It gives you a lot of different experiences. And even in a pretty quantitative program, you quickly learn how many different types of problem people can work on and how different labs function and what kinds of personalities and topic areas you might work well with or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then do you submit your like preferences and they drop you in, or is it then sort of up to you?
You do have to kind of match. I don't think it's a really rigorous match. I think you kind of like will approach the person that you enjoyed working with and see if they have space and resources. And
Yeah.
luckily I did. I mean, I think most people don't take on rotation students if they're not like willing and able to then take on a full-time student.
Fill the spots, yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me about your lab. Tell me about your research.
Yeah. So I ended up in Pensive was the name of the lab. So it was the Penn Statistical Imaging and Visualization Endeavor. which is a kind of hacky acronym.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's kind of
but
cute though.
it was kind of cute. And they now have a logo that's like the thinker on a little hex sticker, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
uh, so it was like a medical imaging analysis lab, essentially. So we worked on a couple different topic areas, but all kind of broadly in the like magnetic resonance imaging
Mhm.
umbrella. So I worked kind of mostly on neurology and multiple sclerosis. Um, so mostly finding ways to build statistical methods that can kind of detect like problems, things to raise to a radiologist's attention in an automated fashion. So if you were to get a scan, like how can we build something that will flag something that looks potentially problematic that a neuroradiologist can then like find and evaluate more formally. And there were some people in the lab who were working on kind of psychiatry applications, like more brain activity kind of data. So a pretty wide cross section there as well. But
That's cool. So the input for your kind of development of the statistical analysis were MRI images. So
yeah,
what were you looking for? Well, so that makes me think of like kind of computer vision algorithms. Were you doing that as well?
I was not.
Okay,
And luckily, I think, sorry, my dog does hallway noises.
that's okay.
Luckily, I kind of got out of the field, I think, at the right time because a lot of these problems are very well suited for kind of more formal deep learning style computer vision.
Yeah,
A lot of the problems I was working on very much are. And there was kind of an undercurrent of that. And I think one of the things that I told myself at the time and still tell myself for why the work was valuable is that a lot of the computer vision approaches that work the best are kind of taking the type of features into their algorithm that have been developed through kind of more statistical and engineering style approaches to these questions. So a lot of the research that was more manual and grounded um, was basically just rigorous multi-year feature engineering
yeah.
for the fancier approaches that are going on now.
Yeah, well, so I kind of I half expected you to answer that question by saying that you didn't, but like you worked with people who did, because
Mm.
it also seems like it could be an interesting collaborative problem where there's computer vision engineers that are picking out certain things, but then there's the statistical model developers, designers or whatever who are looking at that from an impact point of view.
Yeah, I do think there's a lot more of that now.
Yeah.
Um, I think even just a couple of years ago, deep learning was unproven enough in a lot of medical contexts that there was still kind of like a push and pull where people on the more statistical learning side weren't convinced that it was ever going to be reliable or accurate enough or transparent enough to
Yeah.
be trusted in those settings. And I think now it's become clear that in a lot of cases it will be exceptionally accurate and
Hmm.
transparent to an extent that you're willing to have someone then evaluate it after the fact. Um, so there's a lot more collaboration and a lot more explicit kind of incorporation of those approaches, even in
Yeah.
statistical research programs.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah, exciting
Um,
area.
okay, so what did you think you wanted to do with your PhD at any point along the way?
I wavered quite a bit. So after a year and a half, I was pretty sure I was going to leave with my master's
Ah,
and then ended up staying because I got settled in my eventual lab after the rotation period and was very happy there. For a while, I was kind of tailoring some of my research endeavors to be more data sciencey because I thought I wanted to leave research for something in industry, in tech, in biotech, where I thought data science would be more useful. And then somewhere along the line, I decided that I would at least give academia a shot.
Hmm.
Um, and so in my last year or so, kind of focused more on that path and understanding what kind of research program might be uh, valuable in that direction.
And that direction was a postdoc, I imagine, the next step.
That direction was kind of an interesting non-tenure track, like research faculty position.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah. I was very lucky to find it. It's like a strange little satellite biostatistics department within the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Um,
Okay.
and so it's like kind of a psychiatry department that has like a kind of five faculty team of biostatisticians who do methodological research and also collaborate on a ton of psychiatry questions. So yeah, I was in retrospect potentially not the best decision. I
Okay.
do think there's a lot to be said for postdocs, and we could maybe get into this too.
Yeah.
Um, but it's a big jump to go straight into kind of needing to know all the right questions to ask, needing to trust yourself with a kind of valuable research question, and being able to kind of move from a lively team-based environment to like being your own one person lab. So that was a little jarring, and I think ended up not working so
Hmm.
well for me. Um, but yeah, it was a really interesting experience and an interesting department.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we take our first jobs, right? To find out
Yeah.
what we don't want to do. Or, um, that's interesting. So you didn't have to teach classes, you didn't have to mentor students, you just had to do research.
Yeah, you could teach classes if you wanted to teach like in Columbia School of Public Health.
Ah,
They they had that set up. Um, and you also didn't have to mentor students, but you were able to kind of support and like co-mentor PhD students and master students if you wanted to. So the flexibility was really great, and I
yeah.
did get to focus quite a bit on research. Though I think there's potentially an argument for being thrown into some of those other roles
Hmm.
because I don't really know how likely I was ever going to be to like opt into teaching intro stats, but I
Yeah.
think I actually would have gotten a lot out of being sort of forced to teach and to mentor and to engage more outwardly. So another push pull, I guess.
Yeah. Did you have to do like funding getting funding, grant writing? Yeah,
Yeah, I it was mostly collaborative, so I was kind
that's
of
good.
co-investigator on a lot of kind of like psychiatry PIs grants, and that's kind of the primary way you're expected to get funding.
Hmm.
But I did venture out and apply for an R01 as a co-PI with a good friend of mine, and we were unfortunately not discussed. And then I ended up leaving
Leaving.
academia. Another spoiler before we were able to resubmit that. Um, but it was that was also a great learning experience, and there's nothing quite like being asked to like flesh out what the next 5 years of a research program is going to look like, to really isolate the flaws, the things you're uncertain about, the pitfalls. So that was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm I'll echo that and say that I think grant writing is something that not all PhD students really have the chance or um, the the misfortune of doing. But I do think it's an excellent skill, even if you end up outside of academia or somewhere, because you're also just learning how to like tell a story about research and also like sell it to people who aren't necessarily in the lab with you and are maybe like in a related field but not specifically in your field. So it's a really good skill, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I know one or two people whose advisors looped them into that process during the PhD program, and I feel like it's the kind of thing that you're resistant to
Yeah.
participate in at that stage. But to the extent possible, I think it's a really, really valuable thing to at least kind of get some insight into, understand what's going on behind the curtain, what your advisor and your lab mates are doing when they submit that and what it looks like. And yeah, that kind of not really gamesmanship, but just like the skill of crafting something for a specific audience, for a specific review process. Uh, it's a
Yep.
lot of like tacit knowledge that it takes a while to become aware of just by doing it. Uh, so kind of
Yeah.
trying to learn that while you're working with the people who are doing it is potentially quite useful.
Yeah. Did you have any opportunity to TA or anything when you were a grad student?
I did. I'm trying to remember what it was called. I think I TA'd the big like experimental methods in biomedical research type class, like a big survey class with all of the first year biomedical PhD students, where
Gotcha.
nobody wanted to be there. Nobody wanted to learn statistics. That was quite a course.
Did that, I mean, obviously sometimes it's course dependent, but did that make you want to be a teacher of things, like a professor, that side of things?
No, I think it scared me a bit.
Yeah.
I think there are definitely classes that are like inspiring and energizing, and I think they tend to be kind of like the focused classes where everyone has decided that they want to learn a certain thing and they're excited to learn and talk about it. And there's something about like a mandatory survey class on a topic that everyone already kind of hates that
Oh.
really demotivates from from teaching.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. We I was in material science and all the grad students every year had to TA the Intro to Material Science course, which was for all undergraduate engineering majors. So every engineering major had to take an Intro to Material Science course. So we had, just a whole variety of interests because people were interested in all types of engineering, and most of them didn't really care about material science, so that it was very challenging, and it's definitely a different experience than TAing. I also TA'd like one of the grad classes, which was very specific to a topic, and yeah, I completely understand why it
Were,
scared you.
were there any things that you noticed worked better or worse in that intro to materials class that getting people kind of engaged with this material?
Well, so yeah, I mean, we had a lot of graduate students TAing, and therefore we had these kind of little recitation groups, which I think helped because it was such a big lecture class that at least having, 20 students who were used to you as a grad student recitation instructor, there was a little bit more of intimacy when it came to those sessions.
Makes sense.
And then the main professor, he's very good. He does a lot of like online aspects of teaching. So like recognizing that people learn in different ways and not necessarily spending every class talking at students, and providing some interactions, some opportunity to do questions and discussions, and then sharing even videos throughout the week. So it's tough though. It really is tough.
That is interesting. I feel like right when I stopped TAing that class, they were experimenting with kind of a more like flipped classroom approach. And I am curious the effect it had because I do feel like there's a lot of value in getting people to do some of the content on their own, not in a setting like the course, and then using that classroom to like really focus on the interactive and collaborative type of work. So hopefully that worked
Yeah.
in our context as well.
Yeah. Hope so. Um, okay. So you were in this research position. What what's next? What happened after that?
Um, I got lonely, I guess is the short answer. It was a
Yeah.
little isolating. It also didn't help that the 2.5 years that I was in that position at the New York State Psychiatric Institute were like the first 2.5 years of COVID. Um, I was
I
at
was going to ask you that
yeah,
actually, because that I've heard that from other guests who are saying,
yeah,
their first job they started onboarding during COVID and it was just not enjoyable.
yeah, yeah. It is interesting the extent to which it highlights how much like the interpersonal dynamics and energy and miscellaneous conversations in the hallway really add to the research experience. I think
Mm-hmm.
I would have acknowledged that even in graduate school. Like I think people realize it, but I don't think I would have predicted that it was as critical to feeling motivated, to enjoying the work, to feeling like the work is important or is going to go anywhere. Like I think in biostatistics, a lot of papers get like one or two citations, and people
Mm.
kind of reassure themselves those one or two citations are kind of building to a method that's then going to be widely adopted, and you're making an impact. And like all of that kind of just melts away when you're not talking to people who are interested in the work, who are doing things similar, who have feedback, who have questions. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely had a similar experience. The people that you've talked to where onboarding in that moment was not ideal, but I think did make me appreciate
Yeah.
how important that energy and those interactions are, and made me want to encourage them wherever I go to work.
Yeah. Um, so that was 2022? 20.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah,
Okay. So then what was your search like at that point?
it was an interesting and pretty open-ended search. So I looked at some data science, some like biotech, and a combination of had no luck and didn't kind of see myself as a good fit in some of those roles. And then very randomly, after a couple of months of kind of looking around, came upon, well, started thinking that some tangential research I had done in graduate school, more on kind of understanding and mapping the dynamics of scientific research itself, rather than like my primary program. So I kind of did some side work on the science of science, meta science,
Whoa.
which is super fun, very weird. Uh, so I kind of started batting that around and seeing people talking about that kind of research program more often online in kind of social scientific circles, and came upon kind of a science policy nonprofit that was trying to kind of break into the meta science space and think about how kind of federal science funding agencies could encourage more of that type of research on how science works, how it doesn't, how it can be improved, and then also bridge the gap between that research and the actual funding and
Uh,
incentivizing of scientific research from those agencies. So that was fortunate and random, and that's
yeah.
where I find myself now. I've been in that role for 5-ish months, and the nonprofit is called the Federation of American Scientists. It works broadly on science and technology policy, and now on meta science as well.
Very cool. What is your role specifically? Are you like researcher or
It's an interesting it's an interesting organization. So what they focus on relative to kind of some other actors in the science policy space is policy entrepreneurship. So they kind of, I guess not they, we see ourselves as sort of a bridge between kind of scientific practitioners and scientific policy decision makers. So one of the things we focus on is trying to source good ideas that should be implemented in policy kind of from the outside community. So rather than writing a lot of white papers ourselves, um, we are kind
uh,
of trying to identify and support people outside of our own community that like have ideas that we think are important and tractable and valuable for the decision makers that we interact with in government.
So instead of just like feeding, the government decision makers with your opinions, you're feeding them the collection of opinions and ideas that you've collected from um, the other side of things.
Yeah, that's the goal,
Yeah.
at least. I think we
Yeah.
are inspired by the kind of vision of academics doing a lot of really good and valuable work and sort of like throwing it over the wall and kind of hoping that someone else will be there to catch it and bring it to the halls where it can make an impact. I think I'm butchering what I think is a Duncan Watts quote, so I'll let the listeners look up their version of that throwing research over the wall quote. But we kind of try to be the people who are finding that valuable research and are bringing it to the people who could benefit from it and could kind of make it uh, work
Reality.
in action. Yeah, exactly.
So, do you have meetings? Like, do you communicate with like policy makers on the Hill? Is that what they call
Yeah, I'm getting used to the Hill lingo myself.
it?
So I think in my role, I'm interfacing more with people like at the NIH, so kind of the
Mm.
agency leaders, so NIH program officers, NSF, like directorate leaders, um, and a little bit less on the congressional side. So Congress has a big role in kind of allocating the money that these agencies are then kind of giving out through their grant programs and other mechanisms. But I think we see a lot of opportunity, especially in kind of the meta science area. We see a lot of opportunity in figuring out how the agencies themselves can kind of tweak their processes in ways that will support scientists more effectively, kind of improve some of the incentive structures, make the funding go farther. So it's more kind of on that decision making side of things rather than the congressional funding side of things.
Gotcha. That's cool. I have a grad school friend who works at the DOE,
Mm,
and she does I guess it's like program review for some of the energy programs funding. Maybe she even reads proposals. I'm not sure, but it's so interesting to hear
yeah,
about that side of it because like we spent years applying for these federal grants to do very specific, like to basically tailor our own research to the very specific call for a very specific question. And it's interesting to think about, well, who decided to make that something that they're going to fund?
yeah.
You. But you can help, right?
That's the goal. It's really fascinating to see all of that in action. I think I had no concept of what's going on under the hood, and to get to work with some of these people and understand the constraints that they're under, all of the things they're trying to do with minimal support and budget to do it, it's it's really it explains a ton about how things end up
Yeah.
working, and also really just makes me really impressed with a lot of the work that they're able to do under those constraints and a lot of the alignment that there is between the people who are working in these agencies and the people who are out there applying for grants. I think it's always easy to think from afar, like there are so many things that the NIH could do differently, that the DOE could do differently that would make it all kind of go smoother, be better. And I think that is true, and that's what we're trying to support. But there are so many reasons and kind of bottlenecks for why those things aren't as straightforward as it seems like they would be. So just kind of shining the light on the people who are doing really important and impressive work at these agencies and kind of trying to support the scientists that they care a ton about. That's
Yeah.
something that we try to do as well.
So 5 months. So good so far. Are you liking it?
Yeah, it's motivating.
Okay, good.
It's I think similar to academia in that the timelines for impact are long, but I'm at
But
least
there's excitement around you with people who are passionate about what they're doing.
totally.
That's great.
Yeah. And one of the things
Um,
that we're excited about actually is bringing academics not only their ideas into government, but also themselves into government. Um, there are a lot of kind of
oh,
matchmaking programs and opportunities for scientists and other researchers to like spend a year on a kind of civic detail in one of these agencies, either as like a temporary program officer or kind of helping with program design. So I'll just throw that out there.
yeah,
If there are any scientists out there who are interested in this kind of contribution, or even just using it as an opportunity to like learn and understand how these grants are processed, what's going on under the hood. I know more about the NIH's grant programs than I ever did when I was spending years applying for them. It's only
yeah.
been 5 months. So it's an opportunity not only to kind of make a tangible impact at these agencies, but also I think a really good career development opportunity. So
Mm.
anyone listening is welcome to reach out if they want to talk more.
Reach out to you or find the FAS.
Both.
Both. All of the above.
Well, yeah.
Um, very cool. Um, so I'm curious in this time where you're doing a lot of cool stuff, what do you have time for outside of work? What are your hobbies?
Oh, that's such an important question. I, well, as I alluded to, I am taking up tennis for the first time since elementary school.
Nice.
It's exciting.
That's a long gap.
It is a surprisingly long gap. I would have expected it to be a harder hill to climb,
Hmm.
but I like sort of remember what it means to hold a racket, so that's been fun. I have a
What are your thoughts on pickleball?
one of the first questions I asked an instructor that I had a couple weeks ago. I have never played, actually.
Okay.
The the answer I got from the like semi-pro tennis player that I talked to was that he hated it for a while
Yeah.
from afar and then played it a couple times and now sees the appeal. So I think I'll go with that until further notice. How about you?
I hear the same thing. It's so funny because my siblings and I, where we went to high school, pickleball was like one of the gym classes. It was like
Hmm.
pickleball and ping pong and maybe tennis. It was like a mixture of racket sports. And so, I remember playing in like a pickleball tournament, like a doubles pickleball tournament, like after school one day, and like I was really familiar with the sport. And so, but I hadn't thought about it in years. And so then during COVID, when it kind of took off, I was like, oh yeah, I remember this game. And so I always sort of felt positively towards it. But everyone I've talked to, especially tennis players, are initially hesitant, but then can usually be swayed to the enjoyableness of it. It doesn't replace tennis, so you should keep working on your tennis. But
I do think that says a lot about it. That even with like a baseline bias against it, most people come around. So it must
yeah,
be very fun. I will be honest, and maybe this is embarrassing. I did not realize that it was even a sport back then. I thought it was like a new invention.
yeah, most people do because it just wasn't a thing that people played, and I thought it was like a kids game that you played in gym class.
Yeah,
Um, yeah. So anyway, that's a fun fact. You can
mhm.
tell people that too, that it's not new.
I'll definitely swipe it. What other hobbies might
Um,
I be embarking on? What are your out of work activities?
So I've gotten to the point where, especially if I have like a hard day of work with like a lot of thinking and I can't imagine doing anything else, I end up well, I do a lot of puzzles,
Mm,
which sort of became a hobby during COVID, during like lockdown, because it was like something I could focus on and it felt sort of productive in a weird way.
totally.
Yeah. But then I started to pick up some paint by number artwork. That's one actually right there.
Oh, amazing. That's quite
Um,
impressive.
And the cool thing about that is it's kind of like a puzzle in that you're like creating something piece by piece, but then you get this nice piece of artwork to hang on your wall. So,
Oh,
and it's like a little mindless, and sometimes I'll turn on like stand-up comedy while I do it. So I'm like listening to something, you know?
that sounds great. I really like that. I think the only artistic thing I've tried in recent years was watercolor, and I was
Mm.
truly shocked at how bad I was at it. And I immediately,
Watercolor is hard though.
yeah,
It's hard.
appreciate that. If you had said it was
It's
easy, I would have been devastated.
no, it is hard. I think like I think these are acrylics, the ones that I do. So it's like you put the paint where the number is and move on. But with watercolor, it's like how much water, how much color, you know. It's all chemistry. I don't know.
Totally great.
Um, anything besides tennis going on in your life? You have a dog, we've heard.
A little dog that you heard. Her name is Reese. She's a 12-pound Chihuahua Dachshund Pomeranian Pit Bull mix,
Whoa.
or a Dachshwawa.
Wow.
She takes up a lot of time. I intellectually understood what a change it would be going from like not having a living thing that depended on me to having a living thing that depended on me, but I don't think I was like fully mentally prepared for that shift. So that's
Yeah.
been it's incredibly worth it. She's adorable, and I love
Yeah.
her. But
It is. It's a
hard work.
life change.
Yeah,
Yeah. And some people feel that way about kids too. They weren't really prepared for it, but it happened anyway. So there you go. Um, that's great. Um, anything else?
Hmm. Those are the big ones. Doing some reading,
Nice.
reading about Bell Labs right now. Reading-
Ah, like historical.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a it's interesting. I feel like in my role, kind of working on the levers of scientific investment, it's motivated me to like try to understand more about the history and economics and structure of science, which is not really something, surprisingly, when I was like doing science, I never really thought much about the history of it. Um,
Yeah.
but then I'm starting to think about it now, and it's really fascinating. And it's also just fascinating how much you can get lost in the weeds when you're in the world and kind of not uh, not feel pulled to like understand the broader perspective. At least me, I never really did. But yeah,
I'm sure that's true for many grad students who spend their days staring at their samples or whatever. Um, is that a what's the book you're reading about Bell Labs? Is it called Bell Labs?
it is called The Idea Factory. Let me,
Ah, oh, I've heard of that actually.
yeah, by John Gertner.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but always looking for good book
Mm.
recommendations.
So it's finished Chip War, which is about the semiconductor
Oh,
industry. Also very interesting.
oh,
Materials focused.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I should have read those when I was back in grad school. But again, narrow viewpoint, you know.
never too late. I'm not sure they were out,
Never. T-
so you're excused.
oh, there you go. Um, okay, so I'm gonna move on to my three kind of wrap up questions.
Oh,
Sound good? So, do you have anything? Um, well, I'll give you the option. Something challenging or something surprising that you experienced in your PhD.
yeah, it's probably a common answer, but I'll echo it, which is imposter syndrome.
Mm.
There's like a pretty wide range of ways that people do biostat research, and as someone on the applied side of the spectrum, I always felt kind of like a fraud for not being kind of focused on or efficient at the more mathematical proof style statistics. And there wasn't a right or wrong way to be a graduate student and to be a researcher in that field, but I definitely got it in my head for a while that if I wasn't able to do that as well, then I was kind of doing it wrong. So that was probably one of the bigger challenges.
Did you feel, well, first of all, yes, I mean, I'm not surprised that I think a lot of people feel that way, but it shouldn't diminish the impact it has on any student, but did you feel like there were more people around you that had that math background, or that didn't matter because you still felt deficient in that side of things?
It's a good question. I feel like it was honestly a pretty even split. Like I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't outwardly less experienced in math, but I think it's the kind of thing where you just convince yourself that
Yeah.
everyone else is finding it easy, everyone else is just like working through those problems really smoothly, and you're the only one who's struggling. And if you're not kind of like talking about it and seeing
Yes.
those are also like not feeling effective at that. Um,
Yes.
it's really easy to talk yourself into it. Even people who were like also psych majors and had no statistics background, like I found it strangely easy to tell myself that they were immediately whizzes at it and having no trouble at all. So the mind is a wonderful thing.
It's amazing. Yeah. And it sounds like it's fairly common for people to not really talk about it, but then as soon as they do, with like these people that they sort of just met, right? Like the other first years, even, you get to a point where you maybe are comfortable expressing that with them, and you find that they feel the same way, and that helps a little bit. There's a little bit more of a shared experience.
Absolutely.
So, um, my next question is, do you have any advice that you would give yourself early on?
Yeah. And it's advice that I'm trying to give myself now in my new role also. So I think it kind of broadly applies no matter where people find themselves. And that's to spend more time kind of thinking about the long-term end goal of whatever it is you're working on rather than getting bogged down in like the next deliverable. Um, so I think for the first several years of my grad program, I never really gave myself the space and the time to like really roadmap like what medical question was I working towards in my
Mm,
research. And even if that question was like totally unsolvable by myself, like figuring out what unsolvable thing I thought should be solved and then trying to chip away at pieces on that road to solving it, I think would have A, really made me feel more impactful in my work, that I like knew what I was working towards and chipping away at it. And B would have like helped me understand what the next step should be rather than sort of swinging from one research project to the next, which is something that I ended up doing more than I maybe should have or would have liked to. So I think that kind of like long-term road mapping and sketching out desired impact is a useful exercise.
yeah, that's really, really great advice. I think, especially for PhD students, but like you said, everybody, because, like you said, the impact you have as a grad student may not have that sort of level of relevance to the field. But if you know, excuse me, if you know sort of the destination, even if you can make it a percentage of the way there, that is still impressive, and it keeps you on the path, like you said, the road, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great advice. Now I'm thinking about how that applies to my life right now. I'll get back to you.
That's it.
Okay, and last question is, do you have a good memory or story you'd like to share? Something that when you look back on it, you think maybe grad school was okay for that moment. Yeah.
It's a really good question. I think I was lucky to have a really pleasant experience. I really loved my lab. Um, and I think the thing that jumped out at me with this question is kind of a silly answer, but it was one day that I remember very vividly where I got into one of my like very energetic and excited moods about a research question and like had an idea that I was so convinced was going to be incredibly impactful and was going to get published in a top tier journal, the likes of which I never ended up publishing it. And I like marched into my advisor, Aki Shinohara. He's at Penn. He's wonderful. Marched into his office and just like started telling him about this idea and how great it was and how excited I was. And he was incredibly supportive and like asked good questions and like made thoughtful comments, and then basically told me like, go for it. Like, absolutely, you have my support. Take a crack at it. It's a great idea. And within like 24 hours, it was so apparent that it was not a good idea. There were like so many flaws and pitfalls and reasons why even if it had worked, it like would not have been that impactful of a paper. And so I was like really dejected, and I go back into his office and he's like, yeah, I kind of thought that was the case, but you never know. Like maybe you saw something I didn't, and like I was glad that you were going to go for it. And it's like a little goofy, and I guess it's a wasted day, but that to me kind of symbolized the supportive and like energizing nature of that environment and that community, and the ability to like find my way towards the flaws rather than be told them in my moment of excitement, I feel like is like hugely impactful, even though structurally it's not that different. And so I always look back on that very fondly, both like my excitement and just the support and the trust that environment was able to provide. So I try to also be like an energizer and not like shoot things down, just try to give people space to explore ideas. Though I do realize that it's hard, especially in an academic environment where there's like a social capital to like being the smartest one and to seeing all the flaws in some other proposal. I do think there's a ton of value in being someone who kind of energizes and encourages and allows people to find their way to those limitations themselves.
Yeah, that's a great story. I mean, that just goes to show you how good of a mentor your advisor was too, because you know, if he had shut you down in that first moment, you wouldn't have learned anything, and you would have felt bad, you know. But he knew that right?
Mm-hmm.
He knew that you were going to benefit from going through the process, which is so great. And that's, to anyone out there who's listening, that's a great thing to have in a mentor, is that feeling.
Yeah. And Taki, if you're out there, thank you.
Aw, shout out. Well, Jordan, it's been a pleasure to chat and thank you for telling your story. It's been super interesting. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me on. It's been really, really wonderful to talk to you.
Thanks to Jordan for coming on the show. If you or someone you know wants to be interviewed on Impact Factor, feel free to reach out via Instagram and follow us for updates at ImpactFactorPod. Thank you all for listening and have a great week.